9 lessons in graceful goodbye. The story of forbidden love and hard-won wisdom. She had always been the kind of woman who held her spine straight in a room full of chaos. The one people called Dr. Catherine even years after she'd stopped practicing medicine. The one who balanced the federal budget for the Department of Veterans Affairs with the same precision she'd once used to stop a bleeding artery on a deployment runway. What no one knew, what no one could have guessed from her composure in conference rooms and her clip efficiency in emails, was the hurricane she carried inside her chest. The loneliness. The ache of being married to a man who existed mostly as a name on a /deployment schedule and a voice on a phone that rang at odd hours from a different time zone. Catherine Martin was 42 years old, and she had spent the better part of 2 decades learning how not to need anyone. She had been raised in a household in Coathold, Virginia, where love was a transaction measured in GPA points and college acceptance letters. Her parents, her father a retired naval officer who had traded the sea for a recliner, her mother a former high school principal who had turned her classroom management style into a domestic dictatorship, had exactly one metric for Catherine's worth: her grades. Not her happiness. Not her heart. Not the way she felt when a boy first touched her hand in the 10th grade, or the dreams she whispered to herself in the dark. Just numbers on a report card. She had learned early that feelings were irrelevant, that performance was everything, that if she was perfect enough, accomplished enough, she might finally earn the warmth she saw other daughters receive like gifts freely given. She became a doctor because her mother decided she would. A military doctor, specifically, because the 7-year combined undergraduate and medical program at Eastern Virginia Medical Center came with a naval scholarship, and her parents' approval was a tide she could not afford to fight. She graduated top of her class. She deployed twice, once to a field hospital outside Kandahar, once to a naval base in Yokosuka. She saved lives. She earned commendations. She did everything right, and she felt empty doing it. Then she met David. David Martin was a career officer in the Army, a man built like an oak door and possessed of the emotional availability of a filing cabinet. He had been stationed at Fort Liberty in North Carolina when they met, and within 6 months of their first date, a forgettable dinner at an Olive Garden where Catherine had worn a blue dress she would later donate without ever wearing again, they were married. She had been 30, and she had confused stability for love, reliability for passion, the absence of drama for contentment. She had been wrong, but it had taken her 12 years to admit it to herself. The first several years of their marriage were defined by David's deployments. He left for Iraq when Catherine was 34. He came back 30 pounds lighter and with a subtle tremor in his left hand that he refused to discuss and she eventually learned not to mention. Then he left again, for an advisory position in Afghanistan that would keep him overseas for another 2 years. Then again, for a liaison assignment in Stuttgart that stretched into 18 months. Catherine stopped unpacking his deployment bags. She stopped adjusting the pillow side of the bed. She learned to live alone inside her own marriage, a tenant in a house that bore her husband's name but bore no trace of his presence. Her parents, retired now and desperate for purpose, inserted themselves into the raising of her 2 children, Emma, 13, and James, 9, with the same controlling fervor they had once applied to Catherine's academic career. They picked up the kids from school. They drove them to soccer practice and piano lessons. They fed them dinners that Catherine had meal prepped on Sundays, and then they criticized the way Catherine parented, too permissive, too emotional, not structured enough, whenever the opportunity presented itself. Her mother commented on Emma's posture. Her father questioned James's choice of friends. The house that was supposed to be Catherine's sanctuary became another arena where she performed for approval but never came. She was professionally independent, owned her own car, managed her own finances, handled every logistical element of running a household of four, well, sometimes four, people, but emotionally she was drowning. She craved connection the way a diver craves oxygen. She wanted someone to see her. Not Dr. Martin, the federal employee. Not Catherine Martin, the officer's wife. Just Catherine. The woman underneath the regime and the wedding ring and the careful, practiced composure. She wanted to be understood the way the tide understands the shore, completely, inevitably, without having to ask. She did not know, when she first encountered Richard Chen at a regional interagency meeting in the spring of 2023, that he would become the answer to that longing and the source of an entirely new kind of wound. Richard was the director of the Benefits Administration Division at the meeting, tall, silver temple, with the kind of easy authority that came from decades of managing men and women in high-stress environments. He was 48, a retired Army colonel who had spent 23 years in service before transitioning to the civil service side, where his organizational instincts and his preternatural calm made him invaluable. He spoke with the slight southern cadence of a man who had grown up in Georgia but had been reshaped by bases and briefings and the company of soldiers into something more universal. A person who could talk budget allocation with a Pentagon comptroller and then turn around and make a room full of civilian analysts laugh at a self-deprecating joke about his own cooking. He was, by any reasonable measure, magnetic. Catherine noticed him the way one notices a piano melody in a noisy room, something that cut through the ambient noise and demanded attention. He was seated 3 chairs away from her at the conference table, and when the speaker droned on about pension liability formulas, Richard leaned over to the man beside him and murmured something that made them both suppress a grin. Catherine caught the tail end of it, so I told him if he wanted an accurate census, he should probably ask the ghosts, because the living sure weren't cooperating. She laughed. She hadn't meant to. It escaped her like a cough, sudden and involuntary, and Richard's eyes found hers across the table with an expression of conspiratorial delight, as if her laugh was the response he'd been hoping for. He winked. Just like that, a deliberate, playful wink, and then turned back to his notepad as if nothing had happened. That evening, there was a group chat for the conference attendees. Someone had created it to share parking tips and restaurant recommendations, and by nightfall it had devolved into the kind of thread that federal employees everywhere know intimately, a cascade of memes, complaint threads about hotel breakfast, and one persistent voice from the Georgia State contingent who kept trying to make y'all catch on as the group's official greeting. Richard, it turned out, was prolific in the group chat. He posted a gif of a horse riding a bicycle. He responded to a complaint about the conference Wi-Fi with, "I've been in 3 different buildings today, and the Wi-Fi has been equally terrible in all of them. At this point I'm convinced the internet is just a collective hallucination we're all agreeing to pretend is real." When someone posted a photo of the sad continental breakfast spread, Richard replied, "This breakfast is a metaphor for my career, nutritionally void, but somehow I've been staring at it for 45 minutes. Catherine found herself reading the chat, then rereading it, then typing a response before she could stop herself. The breakfast is the universe's way of telling us that the real nourishment was the colleagues we suffered with. Richard replied within seconds, "Catherine Martin, that is the most elegant insult disguised as a compliment I've ever received. I'm genuinely impressed." She stared at the screen. She typed, "I have a medical degree. I specialize in diagnosing things that pretend to be one thing but are actually another." His reply, "Aha. So you're the reason we can't get away with anything in these meetings. I thought it was my conscience." She smiled at her phone like an idiot. Her daughter Emma walked into the kitchen and looked at her with the suspicion that only a 13-year-old can muster for a parent who is smiling at nothing. "Mom, Why are you grinning at your spreadsheet? I'm not grinning. I'm strategizing. At what? At breakfast, Catherine said, and Emma rolled her eyes and left. The conference lasted 3 days, and by the second day Catherine had begun to experience a sensation she had not felt in years, if ever. It was the feeling of being seen. Not evaluated. Not measured. Just seen. The way the afternoon light sees a room and makes everything in it look more interesting than it really is. Richard approached her during a coffee break on day 2. He fell into step beside her at the espresso machine with the easy confidence of a man who had never found it difficult to talk to anyone, and said, "So, Dr. Martin, I've done some research. You're not just a budget analyst. You used to practice medicine. Military hospital, ER, and surgical rotations. That's the significant pivot from saving lives to counting dollars." "It's less bloody," Catherine said. "And the spreadsheets are cathartic. Everything in its place. Debits and credits. Very orderly." "Nothing is ever that orderly," Richard said, selecting a pod for his espresso with the deliberateness of a man choosing a wine. "I spent 23 years trying to impose order on chaos, and I can tell you, the chaos always wins. The trick is learning to dance with it." "Is that what you do? Dance with chaos?" He looked at her then, really looked, not the glancing assessment of professional courtesy but the deep, unhurried gaze of a man who was paying attention. "I'm learning to," he said. "It's harder than it sounds." Something in his tone made her pulse stumble. There was weight behind those words, a subtext she could not quite read but could feel the way one feels a change in barometric pressure before a storm. They talked for 40 minutes. They should have been in the afternoon session on healthcare utilization metrics, but neither of them seemed to notice or care. He told her about his transition from military to civilian service, the culture shock of trading a world of rank and protocol for one of performance reviews and office birthday cakes. She told him about the exhaustion of being the kind of woman everyone assumed had everything together, the competent professional, the capable mother, the dutiful wife to a man who was, at that moment, probably eating MREs in some base cafeteria 12 time zones away. She did not intend to say any of it. It simply came out, like water from a cracked vessel. Richard listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You know what I've noticed about people who carry heavy things alone? They're always the ones who look the most put together. Because they've had to. The mess is private. The performance is public." Catherine felt something shift in her chest, the tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of a life she had believed was stable. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because I'm the same way," he said. 23 years of being the man everyone leaned on. The officer who had the answer. The colonel who never wavered. "You want to know a secret? I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just very good at seeming like I do." He smiled, and the smile reached his eyes in a way that made her feel, absurdly, like crying. The conference ended on a Thursday. They exchanged phone numbers before parting, in case there are follow-up questions about pension formulas, Richard said, and Catherine had laughed because the alternative would have been to acknowledge what the moment actually was. She drove home on I-85 south through the late afternoon light, and the whole way she replayed their conversations in her head like a greatest hits album, each track more compelling than the last. She pulled into her driveway in suburban Charlotte just as the sky was purpling toward dusk, and she sat in the car for a full 5 minutes before going inside, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and trying to remember what her life had felt like before that conference. Her mother was in the kitchen when she walked in, feeding James a snack of apple slices and peanut butter while lecturing her about the importance of structured study time. Her father was in the living room watching Fox News with the volume too loud. Emma was in her room with the door closed, as was her right as a teenager in full rebellion against the concept of family interaction. "Busy day?" her mother asked, without looking up from the cutting board. "Conference," Catherine said. "I told you. 3-day event." "Oh. Right. The benefits meeting." Her mother's tone suggested that anything related to federal employment was a disappointment of the first order, and Catherine felt the familiar deflation, the familiar return to the small, diminished version of herself that her parents had always been able to manufacture without effort. She went to her bedroom. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms against her thighs and breathed, the way her therapist had taught her during the 4 sessions she'd attended 2 years ago before the insurance changed and the copays became untenable. Her phone buzzed. "Richard, made it home. Atlanta traffic is a crime against humanity. Thanks for making this conference actually tolerable." She typed back, "I would say the pleasure was mutual, but mutual would imply we both had the same experience, and I suspect you were actually enjoying yourself." His reply, "I was. Surprising myself as much as anyone. Have a good evening, Catherine." She set the phone on the nightstand. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about her husband, who had FaceTimed her exactly twice in the past month. She thought about the last time David had touched her, not a perfunctory kiss before a deployment, but a touch that communicated want, desire, the specific electricity of being chosen, and she could not remember. It had been that long. She was not a woman who had affairs. She had been raised with rules and expectations, and the clear understanding that good women did not stray. But sitting on that bed, in the quiet of a house where her parents had colonized every room with their opinions and her children were growing up without really knowing their father, and her marriage had become an administrative function rather than a source of intimacy, Catherine felt the first fine crack in the architecture of her fidelity. She did not act on it. Not yet. But the crack was there, and she was aware of it, and that awareness was itself a kind of infidelity, a crossing of an internal border that no one else could see but that she could feel with every heartbeat. They texted for 3 weeks after the conference. At first the messages were professional, questions about healthcare cost allocation methodologies, a link to an article on VA disability reforms, the kind of interaction that could be justified to anyone reviewing a phone bill. But gradually, inevitably, the exchanges softened. They talked about music, about books, about the restaurants they'd been to and the ones they always meant to try. He told her he liked jazz and spicy Thai food and old black and white movies where the dialogue was clever enough to make up for the lack of explosions. She told him she had a secret love of reality TV that she would deny under oath, and that the only exercise she truly enjoyed was swimming because the water didn't judge her for wearing a one-piece. One evening, late past 11, Richard texted, "Can I ask you something personal?" Catherine was already in bed, the house dark and quiet except for the hum of the HVAC. She typed, "That depends. How personal are we talking?" His reply, on a scale of 1 to 10, somewhere around a 7. Maybe an 8. She waited. He typed, stopped, typed again. Finally, "Are you happy?" She stared at the question for a long time. She considered lying. She considered deflecting. But it was 11:15 on a Thursday night and she was alone in her bedroom and her husband was sleeping in a bunk in a military compound somewhere in Eastern Europe, and she had not been asked that question by anyone, herself included, in longer than she could remember. "No," she typed. then deleted it. Then typed, "Define happy." "I can't," he replied. "That's the problem. I've been asking myself the same question for about 6 years and I still can't define it." Something crystallized between them in that exchange, a shared recognition of a mutual wound. Catherine understood, with the clarity of a diagnosis, that Richard was not simply being friendly. He was not simply another conference acquaintance who had found her amusing. He was reaching for her the same way she was reaching for him, across the dead air of their respective marriages, across the impossible geography of their lives, across every sensible reason why this was a terrible idea. She typed, "I'm not happy. I don't think I've been happy for a long time." His response came quickly, "I'm sorry. That sounds like a lonely place to be." "It is," she said. "Lonelier than I know how to say." There was a pause. Then his message, "I went through a period, after my divorce, where I thought I'd never feel connected to anyone again. It took a long time to come back. But I did. Not the way I expected. But I did." She hadn't known he was divorced. She typed, "Divorce? 12 years ago. My ex-wife and I. It was with mutual, in the way that word means we were destroying each other less by living apart. No affairs. No dramatic betrayal. Just two people who grew in different directions and couldn't find their way back. And now? Now I'm married to a woman named Sandra. We have a son, Marcus, he's 14. And I am functional. Present. Responsible. All the things I'm supposed to be." The word functional landed in the conversation like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of recognition through Catherine. Functional. That was exactly the word she would have used. She was functional. The marriage was functional. The family was functional. The whole architecture of her life had been designed for functionality, and she had mistaken function for happiness the way a colorblind person mistakes a red light for a green one. She and Richard texted until 1 in the morning. They did not cross any explicit line, not yet, but the emotion fidelity she had maintained for a dozen years of husbandly absence had begun to fray in a way that felt, to Catherine, less like failure and more like awakening. She fell asleep with her phone still in her hand, the screen dark, the conversation a warm weight in her chest. The confession came on a Saturday in early May, nearly 6 weeks after the conference. They had graduated from texting to phone calls, long, winding conversations that started as check-ins about work projects and spiraled into discussions of childhood fears and marriage disappointments and the specific flavor of loneliness that came from being the strong one in everyone's story. They talked on the phone while Catherine drove to the grocery store, while Richard walked his dog in the evenings around his neighborhood in suburban Atlanta, while the respective noise of their lives faded into the background and left only their voices, intimate as a shared bedroom. On this Saturday, something shifted. Catherine had driven out to Lake Norman to clear her head. David's latest deployment had been extended again. He would not return until the following spring, and she had reached a state of emotional saturation where the house, the kids, her parents' relentless commentary, the entire elaborate performance of her functional life, had become almost unbearable. She needed air. She needed space. She needed someone to tell her that she was more than the sum of her responsibilities. She called Richard from the lakeside parking lot. He answered on the second ring. "I need to tell you something," she said, before he could say hello. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples. "Okay," he said. His voice was calm, prepared, as if he had been waiting for this. "I think about you all the time." Not just as a colleague. Not just as a friend. I think about you in a way that I have no right to think about anyone who isn't my husband. And I know that this is, but she stopped. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. I'm in love with you. I'm sorry. I know that's not fair. But I am. Silence on the line. She could hear the faint ambient noise at his end, the dog barking somewhere, a car passing on a suburban street. She held her breath. Catherine, he said, finally. His voice was gentle in a way that made her eyes sting. You don't need to apologize for how you feel. I need you to understand that this is complicated. I know it's complicated. No, I don't think you do. Not fully. Because if you did, you might not say what you just said, and I need you to be sure. I need you to be really sure. I'm sure. He exhaled, a long, slow breath that she could feel through the phone. There are 6 people involved in this. You and me. David. Sandra. Emma. James. That's not a small thing, Catherine. That's not an affair you can walk away from without leaving bodies on the field. I know. And you and I, we're not just random people who met at a conference. We work in the same federal ecosystem. We have professional circles that overlap. If this goes wrong, it doesn't just end with us. It ends with careers, reputations, lives that aren't ours to damage. She closed her eyes. Are you married to Sandra because you love her, or because it's functional? The silence that followed her question was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Finally, Richard spoke. I love my son more than I've ever loved anyone. And Sandra is a good mother to him, and a decent partner, and I respect her. But your question, you're asking if I'm in love with her. And the answer is no. I am not. I have not been in love with my wife for a very long time. Catherine felt her breath catch. How long? Since before Marcus was born. Since before I retired from the army. This is going to sound terrible, and I don't mean it to be, but Sandra hasn't wanted me, not like that, since she gave birth to our son. She loves me. She needs me. But she doesn't want me. And I have lived in a sexless marriage for 14 years, Catherine. I have been faithful to a woman who doesn't want my body for 14 years, and I have done it because I believe in the vows I made, and because I love my son, and because I thought that was what a good man does. His voice cracked on the last word. Just slightly. A fracture in the porcelain. But Catherine heard it, the sound of a man who had been holding something too heavy for too long and had finally, in the privacy of a Saturday phone call from a lakeside parking lot, allowed it to shift. I understand, she said, and she did. With a ferocity that frightened her, she understood. Catherine, he said, and now his voice was careful, deliberate, the voice of a man building something and knowing that the foundation mattered more than the speed. I need to think about this. I need to think about what you deserve and what I can give you and what this means for everyone. Can you give me a few days? Yes, she said. But please don't tell me no. Please don't make me regret saying this. I won't, he said. I promise. He called back 3 days later. It was a Tuesday evening, and Catherine was at her desk in the home office she had carved out of what should have been a guest bedroom, pretending to review a budget reconciliation report while actually staring at a blinking cursor on a blank document. I've been thinking, he said. Non-stop. I've barely slept. I've thought about nothing else. And and I think we should try something. But we need rules. Boundaries. We need to be smart about this because we're not 25 and we're not reckless, and the cost of getting this wrong is too high." Her throat tightened. "What kind of something?" "The underground party members kind," he said, and she almost laughed at the absurdity of the phrase, but there was nothing funny in his voice. "We become lovers. Secret lovers. We do this carefully, thoughtfully, with full awareness of what we're risking. And we make rules to protect each other and everyone else as much as we can." "You're talking about an affair." "I'm talking about two people who found each other in the middle of lonely marriages and who want to see if there's something real here before we throw everything away. And if there is something real, then we deal with that reality when it comes. But let's get there honestly. Let's see each other clearly first. Let's not make any dramatic decisions based on the fantasy. Let's see what the reality is." Catherine pressed her hand against her mouth. She was crying, and she could not have said whether it was from happiness or fear or the sheer vertiginous thrill of standing at the edge of something irreversible. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. Let's do it." Their first physical encounter was 3 weeks later, on a humid Friday evening in late May. Richard had driven up to Charlotte for a regional coordination meeting that existed on no official calendar and had been arranged via a series of encrypted messages that neither of them would ever admit to sending. He was staying at the Marriott in Uptown, the kind of hotel with blackout curtains and neutral carpet that guaranteed anonymity and enabled forgetting. Catherine had told her parents she was working late. She had told her colleagues she had a family commitment. She had rehearsed the lie so many times it almost felt like the truth. She stood outside room 714 for a full minute before knocking, her hand trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature-controlled hallway. She was 42 years old. She had delivered babies under combat conditions. She had held the hand of a dying soldier and told his family he had been brave. She was not a woman who trembled at doors. But she was terrified. Not of Richard. Of herself. Of what she was about to do. Of who she would be afterward. The door opened and he was there, Richard in a blue linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and the top button undone, looking at her with an expression that contained equal parts desire and tenderness and a nervousness to match her own. He was holding 2 glasses of whiskey on the rocks, and he offered her one like a handshake, a formal introduction to the new reality. "You came," he said. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might. Right up until you knocked. I thought there was a 50-50 chance you'd decide to be sensible." She took the glass. The whiskey was smooth and smoky, and it burned going down in exactly the right way. "I've been sensible my entire life, Richard. I'm tired of sensible." He closed the door behind her. The room was dim, the curtains drawn against the city, the bed pristine with its starched white duvet. It was a room designed for the temporary and the transgressive, and Catherine felt the weight of that design as she set her purse on a chair and turned to face him. They stood there for a moment, the length of a small living room between them, 2 people who had spent 6 weeks falling in love via phone and text and who now had to translate that digital intimacy into physical reality. "I want to kiss you," he said. "But I also want to talk. I need you to know that this is more than physical for me. I need you to know that before anything else happens." "I know," she said. "I feel it too." He crossed the room then. He moved the way he always moved, deliberately, unhurried, with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and was not ashamed of wanting it. He reached her and stopped, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something woodsy and warm, like cedar in old books, and he placed his hand on her cheek, the touch so gentle that it made her breath hitch. "I have wanted this," he said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "From the moment you laughed at that conference breakfast. I have thought about this more times than I will ever admit to anyone." "Then why are we talking?" she whispered. "Because I want you to know that when this happens, when we happen, it's not because I'm taking something from you. It's because we're choosing this. Both of us. With our eyes open." She closed the distance. She kissed him. The kiss was nothing like she had imagined, and everything she had needed. It was slow and deep, and it carried in it 6 weeks of longing and 3 years of emotional starvation and the accumulated weight of a dozen years of marriage to a man who had forgotten, or never known, how to make her feel wanted. Richard kissed her like she was a woman who deserved to be wanted, and she felt something inside her unlock that she had believed was rusted shut permanently. He tasted like whiskey and something sweeter underneath, and his hands moved to her waist and pulled her closer with a possessiveness that was tender rather than aggressive, protective rather than demanding. She put her arms around his neck and pressed herself against him and felt, for the first time and longer than she could calculate, like her body was not merely a vehicle for her responsibilities but an instrument of her own pleasure. They made love that night with a slowness that bordered on devotional. He removed her blouse like he was unwrapping something precious. He traced the topography of her with his hands and his mouth, the curve of her shoulder, the hollow of her throat, the landscape of her stomach that bore the quiet evidence of 2 pregnancies and 42 years of life. He touched her with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes, and when he finally entered her, it was with a slowness that was almost unbearable, a deliberate descent into intimacy that allowed her to feel every increment of closeness, every fraction of the moment they became, physically, irretrievably entangled. She came undone beneath him in a way she had never achieved with her husband, not quickly, not mechanically, not as a checklist item between "did you lock the door" and "don't forget to take out the trash," but slowly, building, a wave that crested and broke over her in a series of shudders that she could not control and did not want to. She made sounds she did not recognize as her own voice. She felt, in the deepest cellular level of her being, seen and chosen and beautiful in a way that years of marriage had failed to make her feel. Afterward, they lay tangled in the white sheets of the hotel bed, the city sounds muffled behind the blackout curtains, and Richard pulled her against his chest and held her the way she imagined people held each other after surviving something catastrophic together. "I haven't felt that in years," he said into her hair. "I mean it. I haven't felt like a man in years." Catherine understood exactly what he meant. "Richard," she said, tracing the scar on his left shoulder, a souvenir from an IED incident during his 3rd deployment, one of the few things she knew about his military years that he had not volunteered. "Tell me about the sexless marriage. Tell me what it's been like." He was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice had the quality of someone opening a door to a room they had kept locked for a long time. "It's been a slow death," he said. "Not dramatic. Not dramatic in the way people expect. It's just been absence. Sandra and I had a normal sex life when we were first married. Then she got pregnant, and the pregnancy was difficult, and after Marcus was born she just shut down. She said it was painful. She said breastfeeding made her feel touched out. She said she was exhausted. And those were all true. But then Marcus turned 2, and then 5, and then 10, and the reasons kept changing, but the result was the same. Nothing. Not once a month. Not once every 3 months. Nothing. How did you cope?" "At first, badly. I was angry. I felt rejected. I couldn't understand how the woman who had once wanted me desperately could look at me now like I was furniture. I begged. I suggested counseling. I cried, Catherine. I am not a man who cries, and I cried in front of my wife, and she told me I was being dramatic. Catherine closed her eyes. She could feel the pain radiating from him like heat from a fire. I went to a doctor, he continued. I had my testosterone checked. I thought maybe something was wrong with me. The doctor looked at my chart and said, Colonel, your levels are fine. The problem isn't your body. The problem is your marriage. And I wanted to punch him because he was right. So what did you do? I buried it. I became the man who didn't need sex. I channeled everything into work, into being a father, into being the officer everyone relied on. I told myself that sex was a small part of a marriage, that intimacy could exist without physicality, that I was mature enough to supplement that part of myself. And I did it. For 14 years, I supplemented it. I lived beside my wife like a monk in a monastery, and I told myself it was enough. And was it? No, he said, simply. It was never enough. It was just survivable. He rolled onto his side and looked at her, his eyes catching the dim light from the bedside lamp. You know what the worst part is? The worst part isn't the lack of sex. It's the way it makes you feel about yourself. It makes you feel invisible, unwanted. Like your body is a disappointment to the one person whose desire should be automatic. It eats at your self-worth in ways you can't articulate. It makes you question every assumption you've ever made about yourself. Catherine reached for his face. She cupped his jaw in her hand. I want you, she said. I see you. You are not invisible to me. He caught her hand and pressed his lips to her palm. And then they made love again, and this time it was different, not the tentative first encounter but the second, which carried with it the confidence of the first having been survived and the joy of discovery giving way to the pleasure of recognition. She knew his body now. She knew the places that made him gasp, the words that made him tighten his grip on her, the specific pressure of his fingers that sent electricity down her spine. She learned him the way she had once learned anatomy, with methodical intensity, with a desire to understand every system and every structure, and she found in the learning of him a satisfaction that went beyond the physical. The months that followed were the most intensely happy of Catherine's adult life, and the most dangerous. They developed rituals. Sunday morning calls when David was likely to be unreachable on a base somewhere and Catherine's children were with her parents at church. Wednesday evening texts that started as simple check-ins and ended as flirtatious exchanges that left Catherine flushed at her desks. Weekend excuses, conferences, training sessions, networking events that allowed Richard to drive to Charlotte or Catherine to fly to Atlanta for regional business. In private, they built a world that existed only for them. He called her when Sandra was asleep. She texted him from the bathroom during her children's soccer games. They created a private language, references to the conference and pension reform and regional coordination that meant nothing to anyone else but encoded everything to them. They bought each other small gifts, books the other had mentioned wanting, a particular brand of Earl Grey tea she loved that was impossible to find in most American grocery stores, a first edition of Hemingway his father had once told him about and he'd never been able to track down until a Charlotte antiquarian proved equal to the challenge. He gave her a necklace for her birthday, a small gold pendant in the shape of a compass rose, because she had told him once that she had always felt lost and he had said, "You're not lost. You're just still finding your way." She wore it every day, tucked beneath her blouse where no one could see it, a secret talisman against the loneliness that had defined so much of her life. He took care of her parents in ways her husband never had. When her father had a cardiac scare in July, false alarm, but terrifying while it lasted, Richard called the best cardiologist at the VA hospital and used his old military connections to get her father an appointment within 48 hours. When her mother needed surgery for a hip replacement, Richard knew exactly which hospital to recommend and which surgeon to request, and he called Catherine afterward to check on her, his voice a steady presence in a day of chaos. But beneath the joy, there was a current of anxiety that Catherine could not suppress. She was, despite herself, deeply insecure about the relationship. She was not the only woman in Richard's life. She should be replaced. She was 42, post-pregnancy, exhausted by the logistics of a double life, while Richard worked in an environment where younger, prettier, less complicated women passed through daily. She knew this was irrational. She knew that what they had was real and extraordinary. But irrationality, she was learning, has very little to do with love. She began to demand things. She texted him during work hours and spiraled into anxiety when he did not reply within an hour. She questioned him about where he was, who he was with, why he had not responded to her last message. She interrogated him about his wife's schedule. When was Sandra traveling? When was Marcus at a friend's house? When could they see each other? And she grew resentful when his answers did not align with her hopes. She lost herself in the needing. The woman who had once held her composure in a field hospital under mortar fire became a creature of anxiety and need, texting Richard in the evenings while her children did their homework in the next room and her mother-in-law commented on her distraction. She demanded more. More time. More attention. More reassurance. More proof of his love. She turned into the one thing she had sworn she would never become, a clinging, anxious, possessive woman who measured her worth by the speed of another person's response to her text messages. And Richard, who had been patient and present and loving, began to pull back. Not dramatically. Not obviously. But she felt it, the slightly longer pauses before his replies, the conversations that ended a few minutes earlier than usual, the gifts that came less frequently, the phone calls that were warm but hurried. She felt him creating space where there had been none, and her response was to tighten her grip, which drove him further away, which tightened her grip even more. It was a spiral, a doom loop, and Catherine was too deep inside it to see the pattern. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening in October. Catherine had texted Richard that afternoon asking if he could call her that evening. He said yes. But by 7 o'clock, no call had come. She texted, "Are you still coming?" No response. At 8, she texted again, "I'm waiting." No response. At 9, her anxiety had curdled into something darker, panic, fury, the conviction that he had simply gotten bored of her and was too cowardly to say so. She called him. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding breathless. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "I've been waiting for hours." "I'm sorry. I got held up. Sandra needed help with Marcus. His math tutor called and there was a situation. You couldn't have texted me? Even one text? Do you have any idea how I felt these past 3 hours?" "Catherine, no. You don't get to say I'm sorry and expect everything to be fine. I waited. I was worried. I thought something had happened or that you just decided you were done with me. I would never just decide that. You know that. I don't know anything anymore, Richard. I don't know where we stand. I don't know if this is real to you. I don't know if I'm just, you're not just anything," he said, and his voice was firm now, A commander's voice, the voice of a man who had managed crises in war zone and would not be rattled by an emotional confrontation in a Sunday evening phone call. You are not an option. You are not a convenience. You are not something I am done with. You are the most important person in my life outside of my son. And I understand that you're scared. I do. But I need you to hear me. I am not leaving you. Then why does it feel like you are? Why does it feel like every week there's less of you to give? The silence on the line told her that her fear had landed, that it had exposed something in him that he had not wanted to confront. Because, he said, quietly, I am a man with limits. And you are asking me to exceed my limits, and I can't. I have a career. I have a wife. I have a 14-year-old son who needs me to be present and functional and not emotionally compromised. I have a staff of 40 people who depend on me to show up steady every single day. And I love you, Catherine. I love you in a way I did not think I was capable of anymore. But I cannot give you everything you are asking for. I don't have it to give. She was crying now, silently, the tears running down her face while the television in her living room blared football commentary and her children were upstairs and her parents' voices filtered in from the kitchen where they were preparing lunches for the week. Then what can you give me? She whispered. I can give you what I have. I can give you a part of myself that I don't give to anyone else. I can give you Thursday evenings and Sunday mornings and whatever weekend days I can manufacture without suspicion. I can give you honesty. I can give you fidelity within the boundaries of what we've agreed to. But I cannot give you my whole life, Catherine. I cannot give you a divorce and a new identity and a house on a beach somewhere. I can only give you what I have, and I need you to decide if that's enough. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. It was also the most painful. She hung up without answering. She turned off her phone. She went to bed and lay in the dark and felt the full catastrophic weight of what she had done to herself, how she had taken the strongest, most composed, most self-sufficient version of herself and dismantled it in the service of a love that was never going to be able to consume her whole life because her whole life was not available to be consumed. The next morning, she called her therapist. The same one she had seen 2 years ago before the insurance change. The one who had taught her to breathe through panic and to name her feelings instead of drowning in them. Dr. Adele Okafor, who had an office in South Park and a calm, measured voice that Catherine could hear even in her imagination. I need to come back, Catherine said. I need help. Dr. Okafor's office smelled like sandalwood and old books, which Catherine found paradoxically comforting. It reminded her of Richard's cologne, which reminded her that she was here because of him, which reminded her of everything that was wrong and complicated and precious about her life. Tell me what's happening, Dr. Okafor said. She was a small woman in her late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and an expression of absolute attention. The kind of listening that made you feel like the most important person in the world and also like you could not get away with a single dishonest word. Catherine told her. All of it. The conference, the phone call, the hotel room, the necklace, the spiraling need, the Sunday night confrontation, the devastation of hearing that the man she loved could not give her everything. She told Dr. Okafor about David, who was still deployed and who had become less a husband than a recurring line item in her mental accounting of her life. She told her about her parents, about Emma and James, about the house that felt like a stage set of a family rather than an actual family. She told her about the woman she had been before Richard, the competent, contained, self-sufficient, and the woman she had become in his absence, unneedy, frightened, clutching. I lost myself, Catherine said. I became someone I don't recognize. And the worst part is, I did it for love. Isn't that supposed to be romantic? Isn't that what all the stories say you're supposed to do? Dr. Okafor leaned back in her chair. Catherine, I want you to consider something. The stories that tell you love is supposed to consume you, take over your identity, make you lose yourself. They're not actually love stories. They're possession stories. Love, real love, the kind that lasts, doesn't take yourself from you. It reflects yourself back to you. It makes you feel more like yourself, not less. But what if the self I was before was hollow? What if the competent, contained Catherine was just another performance, like the one I do for my parents? That's an important question. And it might be true. But here's the thing, turning to another person to fill a hollowness inside yourself puts an impossible burden on that person. You ask them to be your self-worth, your identity, your emotional supply, your purpose. No one person can be all of those things for another person. It's not love that fails in those situations. It's the attempt to use one person to solve the problem of yourself. Catherine sat with that for a long time. She thought about her parents, who had raised her to perform rather than to feel. She thought about David, who had been an absence so consistent it had become a presence. She thought about Richard, who had made her feel alive for the first time in years and whom she had then tried to consume in the way a drowning person consumes air, desperately, without restraint, without consideration for the other person's capacity to breathe. What do I do? Catherine asked. You decide what you can accept, Dr. Okafor said. You look at the situation clearly, the real situation, not the fantasy, and you ask yourself, can I love this person within the boundaries of what they can offer? Can I receive their love without demanding that it fill every void I have? Can I be in relationship without losing myself in it? And if the answer is no, if the boundaries are too small, if the pain of limitation outweighs the joy of connection, then you make the harder choice. What harder choice? To leave. Or to stay, but differently. To renegotiate the terms. To become, as you put it, something other than what you've been. Catherine left Dr. Okafor's office that day with homework. She was to spend the following week paying attention to moments when she felt the urge to text Richard with anxiety or demand or need. She was to pause in those moments and ask herself, what am I really feeling right now? What void am I trying to fill with his response? And was she willing to name that void and address it herself, rather than outsourcing it to a man who was already giving her as much as he had? It was the most difficult assignment she had ever been given, harder than any medical board exam or military training exercise, because it required her to do the one thing she had never learned to do, sit with her own discomfort without running from it or demanding that someone else fix it. She started that night. She felt the urge to text Richard, to apologize for Sunday, to reassure herself that he still loved her, to schedule their next meeting. Instead, she sat with the urge. She breathed. She named what she was feeling, fear. Fear of losing him. Fear of being alone. Fear of discovering that the best thing in her life was still not enough to make her whole. She breathed through the fear. She did not text him. He texted her an hour later, I miss you. I'm sorry I can't call tonight. Marcus has a school thing. But I wanted you to know I'm thinking of you. And Catherine with Catherine, who, a week ago, would have read that message and immediately demanded a longer conversation, a more detailed explanation, a commitment to a specific call time, simply replied, thank you. I miss you too. Enjoy Marcus's thing. I'll be here when you can talk. She pressed send and then sat, stunned, at the sense of peace that flooded her. She had not demanded. She had not spiraled. She had received his message and she had responded to what was actually their warmth, affection, limitation, and she had accepted the limitation without trying to pry it open. It was a small thing. It was also, for Catherine, revolutionary. The transformation did not happen overnight. It was a slow, uneven, often discouraging process of learning to be in her own skin again. Catherine Mark II, she called herself, a woman who was in love but not consumed by it, who could hold Richard's love in one hand and her own selfhood in the other and not confuse the two. She started swimming again. 3 mornings a week, before the house woke up, she drove to the YMCA on Selwyn Avenue and swam laps in the pool while the rest of the city slept. The water was cool and neutral, and it asked nothing of her except movement. She found, in those early morning length, a solitude that was restorative rather than lonely, a space where she did not have to be anyone's wife or mother or daughter or lover, just a body moving through water with increasing fluidity and grace. She reconnected with an old friend from her military hospital days, a woman named Patrice who had transferred to a VA hospital in Nashville and who had, like Catherine, spent years building a functional life atop a foundation of emotional neglect. They talked on the phone every other Sunday, women who had been shaped by the same institution and the same expectations, and the conversations reminded Catherine that she was not unique in her loneliness and that her story, while deeply personal, was not without precedent or company. She began to read again, not self-help books or parenting guides or the professional journals that constituted her entire recreational reading life before Richard, but actual literature, fiction, the kind of books she had loved in college before her mother had declared English literature a frivolous major and steered her toward medicine. She read Philip Roth. She read in Tyler. She read a novel about a woman in an unhappy marriage who has an affair, and she found herself crying on the couch at 11 p.m. while Emma was at a sleepover and the house was quiet, not from sadness but from recognition, the particular ache of seeing your own experience rendered by someone else's prose with a precision that felt like accusation and comfort simultaneously. She started wearing the necklace openly, not tucked beneath her blouse, but displayed, the compass rose catching the light at her throat. It was a statement, a private one, a reminder to herself that she had chosen this, that she was not a victim of her circumstances but an agent within them. Richard noticed the change. He noticed it in the quality of her presence when they were together, no longer frantic, no longer grasping, but relaxed and curious and genuinely interested in him rather than in what he could provide. She asked about his day. She listened to his answers. She laughed at his jokes without measuring whether the laughter was sufficient proof of his devotion. She had stopped treating their time together as a resource to be hoarded and started treating it as a gift to be savored. "I've missed you," he said one Thursday evening in November, a month after she'd begun therapy. They were in the same hotel room in uptown Charlotte, their room now, in some ways more familiar to her than her own bedroom, but the energy was different. Softer. They were sitting on the bed with takeout from a Thai restaurant down the street, and Richard had his arm around her shoulder, and for the first time since the affair began, Catherine felt no anxiety about what came next. "I've been working on some things," she said. "Therapy, reading, swimming, trying to figure out who I am when I'm not terrified." "And what are you finding?" She considered the question. "I'm finding that I was using you to avoid myself. Not because you were insufficient, but because I had never learned how to be okay alone. My parents raised me to seek external validation. My marriage rewarded me for being functional rather than happy. And then I met you, and you made me feel things I'd never felt, and I thought, if I can just hold on to this hard enough, if I can just get enough of him, I'll finally feel whole. But that's not how it works." "No," he said. "It's not. You can't fill a void that I refuse to look at, Richard. I had to learn to sit with the void, to name it, to stop asking you to be my therapist and my father and my lover and my purpose all at once. You can't be all that. No one can. He kissed the top of her head. I'm proud of you. I mean that. This can't have been easy. It hasn't been. But I feel better. Not perfect. Not without the fear. But better. That night, they made love with a tenderness that was different from before, not the urgent rediscovery of the early months, not the desperate clinging of the anxious period, but the quiet physical communion of two people who had found their way back to each other after nearly losing what they had. Catherine was more present in her body than she had ever been, more aware of sensation and connection, less in her head about whether the act meant enough or whether he was still attracted to her or whether the relationship was progressing at the right pace. She was simply there, in the moment, with him, and the moment was enough. Afterward, Richard held her in the dark and said, I want to tell you something, and I need you to just hear it without responding. Okay. I am not going to leave my wife. I am not going to divorce Sandra. I love you, but I love my son more, and the structure of my life, the marriage, the stability, the routine, those are the things that allow me to function at the level Marcus needs me to function at. I need you to know that. Not because I want to hurt you, but because you deserve to know the truth about what this is. Catherine felt the familiar clutch of grief, the small, sharp ache of limitation, of the thing you cannot have no matter how much you want it. But this time, she did not argue. She did not plead. She did not try to convince him that he was wrong about his own life. Okay, she said. I hear you. You don't have to say anything else? No. I think I needed to hear that. Not because it doesn't hurt, but because the not knowing was worse. The hoping for something that wasn't going to happen was eating me alive. And now I know. And I can make a decision with the truth, not with the fantasy. What kind of decision? She turned to face him in the dark. Whether to stay in this with my eyes open. Whether to love you on the terms you can actually offer, or to walk away and protect myself. I don't have to decide tonight. But I get to decide. That's what you've given me. The dignity of choosing. He kissed her forehead. I don't deserve you. Yes, she said. You do. That's why this is so hard. She stayed. She chose to stay, with her eyes open, with the truth acknowledged and integrated rather than denied and resisted. She stayed because the love, real, complicated, bounded love, was worth more to her than the pain of its limitations. She stayed because Richard made her feel alive in ways that her marriage never had, and because the alternative, a return to the functional emptiness of her previous life, was more frightening to her than the risk of this. But the ending, when it came, arrived like weather. It was a Tuesday in February, 4 months after the November conversation, when Richard called her at 6 a.m. and asked if she could talk. His voice was strange, it flattened, careful, the voice of a man who had rehearsed what he wanted to say and was holding himself to the script with deliberate discipline. I've been thinking, he said, about us, about where this is going, and I've realized that I can't do this anymore. Catherine sat on the edge of her bed. The room was dark. Her phone was cold against her ear. She felt as though the floor had tilted beneath her, a sudden shift in the architecture of everything she had believed was solid. What do you mean? She heard herself ask. I mean that I love you, and that is precisely why I have to end this. I've watched what this does to you, the anxiety, the fear, the months of therapy, The way you hold yourself together in my presence and fall apart when I'm gone. I am not worth that. I am not worth the cost of what this is doing to you. That's not your decision to make. It's not your decision to make either. That's exactly my point. This relationship has been consuming both of us in ways we didn't anticipate. And I've reached a point where I cannot in good conscience continue to take from you what I cannot give back. I can't give you a future. I can't give you a life where you're not always wondering when the next message is coming, always managing the secret, always putting pieces of yourself in a box labeled for him only. That's no way to live, Catherine. You deserve more than pieces. She was crying now, silently. The tears she had learned not to show him during their months of crisis now streaming down her face in the dark of her bedroom at 6 in the morning while her children slept in the next room and the house was so quiet she could hear the refrigerator humming. "Please don't do this," she whispered. "I have to. And you know why? Because I love you. And love doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes love means having the courage to let go when holding on would cost the other person more than they can afford to pay." She wanted to argue. She wanted to plead. She wanted to say every desperate thing that came to mind. "I'll accept less. I'll take whatever you can give. I don't need a future. Just don't leave me." But she heard, in his voice, the same quality of finality she had heard in Dr. Okafor's office when the doctor had told her that some patterns cannot be broken as long as you remain inside them. She heard the truth, and she hated it. When she asked, "Not today. Not this week. I want to do this slowly, thoughtfully, the way we started. I want to give you time to adjust. I'll be here for the next few months as we transition. And after that, I think we should go back to being what we were before the conference. Colleagues. People who respect each other. Friends, maybe, if you can stomach that. But not this. Not lovers. Not whatever this is. You're asking me to lose you. No. I'm asking you to keep a different version of me. The version that was your friend. The version that made you laugh in group chat and listened to you on the phone and reminded you that you were worth something. That's still here. That doesn't have to go anywhere. But you are." "Yes," he said. "I am. Because the version of me that you love, the one who makes love to you in hotel rooms and sends you compass necklaces and calls you at 6 in the morning, that version is going to destroy you if I don't put a stop to it. And I love you too much to let that happen." The conversation lasted another 40 minutes. They talked about what they had given each other. They talked about what they had learned. They talked about the ways this relationship had changed Catherine, her therapy, her reading, her swimming, her renewed sense of self, and Richard spoke about what she had given him. "You reminded me I was still a man. You gave me back my body in some way I can't explain. For years I felt like a ghost in my own life, just going through the motions. You made me feel real. I will carry that for the rest of my life, even if I can no longer carry you." When they hung up, Catherine sat on the edge of her bed in the gray pre-dawn light and felt the grief move through her like a wave. Not a tsunami, not the catastrophic collapse she had feared during her anxious months, but a wave, large and powerful and survivable. The kind of wave that knocks you down and then recedes and leaves you gasping on the shore but alive. She got up. She dressed. She drove to the YMCA and she swam 40 laps in the indoor pool while the city was still dark. And when she climbed out of the water, her arms were trembling and her lungs burned, and she felt, for the first time in months, like she was in her body and not outside it, watching herself from a distance. She drove home. She made breakfast for her children. She drove Emma to school and listened to her talk about a boy in her algebra class who had loaned her a pencil and whether this constituted a sign of romantic interest. She came home and helps James with his science project, a working model of the water cycle involving a plastic bag and a sunny window. And she did not think about Richard once during the entire morning. And when she realized this, she felt a pang of something that might have been hope. It took 4 months for them to transition from lovers to friends. The process was as painful as Richard had promised it would be, and considerably more awkward than either of them had anticipated. There were moments when Catherine would receive a text from him and feel her heart lurch before she remembered that the text was about pension reform and not about the ache in her chest. There were moments when Richard would call to discuss a regional policy matter and Catherine would hear, beneath his professional tone, the echo of the man who had once whispered her name in a hotel room in uptown Charlotte. They stumbled. They withdrew. They came back together in small, careful ways, a coffee at a neutral location, a work conference where they were professional and cordial, and both went home afterward and cried in separate bathrooms. She kept the necklace. She did not wear it openly anymore, but she did not take it off. It was a reminder that she had been brave once, that she had felt something real, that she had loved a man with the kind of ferocity that changes a person permanently. The compass rose was pointing, always, toward something, toward forward, toward the next chapter of a life she was still learning to inhabit. Here are the 9 lessons Catherine took from the affair, the 9 insights she carried with her out of the underground and back into the light of ordinary life, the hard-won wisdom she would share with anyone wise enough to listen. Lesson 1. Affairs don't happen because love is missing from one place. They happen because 2 people are brave enough, or reckless enough, to admit that the love they have is not the love they need. The affair is not a failure of the marriage. It is a symptom of a larger hunger that existed before the affair began and that no single person can satisfy. Catherine learned that she had been starving long before Richard walked into her life, and that the affair had forced her to finally name that starvation instead of medicating it with functionality. Lesson 2. The person you have an affair with cannot save you. Richard was not Catherine's savior. He was a mirror. He showed her the shape of her own hunger, her own loneliness, her own capacity for feeling, but he could not feed those hungers, he could only illuminate them. The real work of healing was hers to do, alone, with the help of a therapist and the quiet discipline of swimming laps at dawn. Lesson 3. Limit. She had heard insufficiency. She had heard proof that she was not worth the sacrifice. But what she was actually being told was something more true and more bearable, that love exists within boundaries, that devotion has limits, and that limits are not the enemy of love, but the condition that makes love possible. A love without limits is not love, it is consumption. Catherine learned that the space between what she wanted and what could be given was not an absence but a shape, and that the shape of their love, constrained, bounded, finite, was what made it real. Lesson 4. Jealousy is a signal, not a verdict. Catherine learned to stop fighting her jealousy, the jealousy of Sandra's proximity, of the wife who got the mundane hours, of the woman who shared a legal name and a mortgage with the man Catherine loved. Instead, she learned to ask what the jealousy was telling her. It was telling her that she wanted more than was available, and that wanting was information, not an instruction. She could want without acting. She could feel the ache without letting it drive the car. Lesson 5. The best version of yourself is not the desperate version. During her anxious months, Catherine had been at her worst, clingy, demanding, incapable of tolerating a 3-hour gap in communication without spiraling into catastrophic thinking. Richard had been retreating from that version of her, not from the core Catherine, and once she had done the work of rebuilding her own self-worth, their relationship had improved dramatically. She learned that the way to keep someone was not to hold them tighter but to become someone worth staying for. Lesson 6. Secret relationships are exhausting in ways that are not romantic. The clandestine nature of the affair, the hidden texts, the cover stories, the hotel rooms, the guilt of lying to her children and her parents and her colleagues, had been a weight Catherine had not fully accounted for. She had imagined the secrecy as part of the thrill, the way affairs are portrayed in films and novels, but the reality was different. The secrecy was degrading. It required constant vigilance, constant emotional labor, constant management of two overlapping realities. She learned that the energy she spent maintaining the secret was energy taken from the relationship itself, and that the transparency she craved was not a luxury but a necessity for genuine intimacy. Lesson 7. Therapy is not weakness, and it is not optional. Catherine's 4 months with Dr. Okafor were the most uncomfortable and the most transformative months of her adult life. She was forced to confront patterns she had spent 40 years perfecting: the performance, the people-pleasing, the external validation-seeking, the inability to sit with her own emotions without immediately trying to fix them or flee from them. She learned that the void she had been trying to fill with Richard's attention was a void that had been carved into her by her parents' emotional neglect, and that no lover could repair damage that had been done in childhood. Only the slow, painful, unflinching work of therapy could do that. Lesson 8. Ending an affair gracefully requires letting go of the story you wanted. The hardest part of the ending was not the loss of Richard, though the loss was genuine and significant. The hardest part was surrendering the narrative Catherine had been building, the secret lovers who would find a way, the impossible love that would triumph, the future that had been taking shape in her imagination for a year and a half. The ending required her to kill that story, to let it die, to grieve it, and to accept that the real story, two people who loved each other within limits and then had the courage to release each other, was actually more beautiful and more true than the fantasy had ever been. Lesson 9. You can love someone and still choose yourself. This was the ultimate lesson, the one that Catherine carried out of the affair and into the rest of her life. She had entered the relationship believing that love meant sacrifice, that devotion meant self-abandonment, that the measure of her love was how much she was willing to give up for the other person. She left it understanding something different, that the highest form of love was the kind that could look honestly at what it was costing and have the courage to say, "I love you, but I love me too, and I am not willing to destroy one in order to keep the other." Richard had taught her this, in the end, by modeling it, by demonstrating that the most loving thing he could do was let go, even though letting go was the hardest thing he had ever done. Summer came to Charlotte in June, the way it always does in the South, suddenly, aggressively, as if the heat had been waiting in the wings all spring and finally decided to make its entrance. The azaleas gave way to crepe myrtles. The humidity rose to the point where stepping outside felt like walking into a warm washcloth. Emma finished 8th grade and prepared for high school with the casual confidence of a teenager who had never doubted her own competence. James learned to ride his bike without training wheels and rode circles around the driveway, while Catherine watched from the porch with a glass of iced tea, sweating rings on the armrest. David came home in July. He had been transferred to a domestic posting, a training assignment at Fort Jackson in Columbia, South Carolina, 90 minutes from Charlotte, and for the first time in 4 years, her husband would be home every night. The adjustment was stranger than she had expected. They moved around each other in the kitchen with the careful courtesy of roommates, navigating the issue of shared space with the kind of deliberate politeness that is the hallmark of two people who are aware they have become strangers but are not yet sure whether to mourn or embrace the fact. On a Sunday afternoon in August, Catherine found herself alone in the house for the first time in weeks. David had taken the kids to a movie. Her parents were visiting her sister in Richmond. She sat on the back porch in the thick August heat and watched the sprinkler chase patterns across the grass, and she thought about Richard, not with the raw, searing pain of the early months, but with a quieter ache, the kind of ache that comes from missing something you have consciously chosen to set down. She thought about the phone call in February, the one that had dismantled her fantasy and rebuilt her into something stronger. She thought about the 9 lessons. She thought about the compass necklace in her jewelry box, and whether she would ever wear it again, and whether wearing it mattered if the meaning was already inscribed in her. Her phone buzzed. A text from Richard. Occasional contact had resumed, as he'd promised, in the form of birthday wishes and professional acknowledgments and the occasional article link that referenced something they discussed. "I saw a cardinal this morning," the text read. Bright red. "It made me think of you." She smiled. She typed back, "Why does the cardinal make you think of me?" "Because they're impossible to miss. They're bright and surprising, and they show up when you least expect them, and they make everything around them more colorful just by being there." Catherine stared at the message for a long time. She thought about responding with something clever, something that would demonstrate her composure, her healing, her heart-won equilibrium. Instead, she typed, "Thank you. That made my day." She set the phone down. She watched the sprinkler. She felt the heat of the August afternoon pressing against her skin like a hand, warm and insistent and present, and she thought, "This is my life. This imperfect, complicated, functional and something more life. This is the one I have, and the one I am choosing, and the one that contains within it the capacity for both devastation and joy." She was 43 years old. She was a mother and a wife and a former doctor and a federal employee and a woman who had loved someone she should not have loved and who had learned, in the losing of him, how to hold on to herself. She was not happy, exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for the complexity of her inner life, too small a container for the mix of grief and gratitude, loss and growth, limitation and freedom that had become her permanent emotional landscape. But she was present. She was awake. She was here, in this backyard, in this heat, in this life that was hers and no one else's, and she was not going back to sleep. The cardinal, she decided, was a good enough metaphor for everything. It was bright. It was surprising. And it showed up. The weeks after Richard's call in February were the longest of Catherine's life. Not because they were filled with drama, they were, in fact, conspicuously free of it. Richard had meant what he said about a slow transition. He did not disappear. He did not ghost. He simply receded, the way a tide recedes, gradually, inevitably, leaving Catherine standing on the shore of their history trying to understand what had been left behind. They had agreed to a communication schedule that felt more like a business arrangement than a love affair. Brief check-in texts on Wednesdays, a phone call on alternate Sundays. Nothing that would constitute what Richard called contact that undermines the transition. Catherine understood the logic. She hated it. She hated the way she found herself refreshing her phone every few minutes on a Tuesday afternoon waiting for a message that was not scheduled to arrive until Wednesday, the way her body betrayed her in ways her mind could not control. She thought about him constantly. She thought about him when she was driving and nearly rear-ended a minivan on Tavola Road because a song came on the radio that reminded her of their first hotel room. She thought about him when she was in meetings at work and found herself staring at the conference table where they had first made eye contact and laughing at a breakfast joke that no one else found funny. She thought about him at night, lying beside David in the bed that had once felt like a staging ground for loneliness and now felt like a stage for a different kind of performance. The performance of normalcy, of domesticity, of a woman who had returned from an affair and was trying to pretend she had not been permanently altered by what she had experienced there. The cruelest part was that David had not changed. He was still the same man, present, responsible, emotionally unavailable in the way that military service seemed to require of its officers, as if the army had a protocol for suppressing the interior life and David had followed it with admirable discipline. He ate dinner at the table. He helped with the dishes. He attended James's soccer games on Saturday mornings with the attendance record of a man determined to prove he was committed to fatherhood. He was, by every external measure, a good husband. And Catherine sat across from him at dinner each night and felt the distance between them like a geographic feature, a mountain range, an ocean, something vast and uncrossable that had nothing to do with Richard and everything to do with the accumulation of small and large absences that had calcified into something that looked like marriage but was actually just cohabitation. She thought, I went somewhere and came back, and he doesn't know I left. I crossed a border and came home, and the passport stamp is invisible to everyone except me. And now I have to live inside the country I came back to, knowing that another country exists, knowing what the light looks like over there, knowing that I can never unknow it. This was the thing about affairs that the stories never told you, the thing that separates literature from life. The affair ends, but the knowledge does not. You carry what you learned in the other country back into the one you live in, and you can never again pretend that the life you were living before was the only life available to you. You have been internationalized in a way that cannot be reversed. You have seen the other option, and the other option glows in you like a city visible from the airplane window at night, beautiful and inaccessible and always, always there. She resumed therapy with Dr. Okafor with a new urgency, going every week instead of every other week. The sessions now focused not on managing her anxiety about Richard's unavailability, but on processing the grief of an ending she had both sought and dreaded. Grief is not linear, Dr. Okafor said during one session in March, when the azaleas were beginning to bloom along the sidewalks of South Park, and the days were getting longer and Catherine was still waking up at 3 a.m. with her heart pounding and her mind replaying Richard's voice on the phone. I have to end this. Everyone keeps saying that, Catherine said. But what does it actually mean? It means that you will not move through this in stages. You will not go from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance like a conveyor belt. You will circle back. You will think you are healed and then find yourself crying in a parking lot because a song came on the radio. You will feel fine for 3 weeks and then feel as though you are back at the beginning. This is not failure. This is the actual process. It doesn't feel like a process. It feels like being lost. Those are the same thing, Catherine. The process of grief is the process of being lost. You are lost. You have been lost since February. The question is not how to find your way back to where you were before the affair. You cannot go back. The question is how to find your way forward to somewhere new. Where is somewhere new? I don't know. That's your question to answer. But I can tell you this, it exists. The forward direction exists. You just haven't been able to see it yet because you've been looking backward, trying to reconstruct something that is already gone. Catherine went home that night and sat in her car in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. She watched the front porch light flicker in the early spring darkness, a bulb that needed replacing, one of 50 small household failures she had been ignoring since Richard had walked into her conference room and rearranged the architecture of her interior life. She thought about calling someone. Anyone. Her sister in California. Her old friend Patrice in Nashville. Any of the dozen women she had been meaning to connect with since the affair had taught her the value of female friendship and the cost of isolation. She called no one. She went inside. She made dinner. She ate with David and the kids and her parents, the 6 of them seated around the dining table that her mother had insisted on buying when Catherine and David had first moved into the house, a table large enough to seat 8, purchased by a woman who had always believed that family dinners were the glue of civilization and who could not conceive of a world in which the glue had long since dried and the pieces were being held together by habit and obligation rather than any genuine bond. Emma talked about a test she had coming up. James talked about a video game. David asked about Catherine's day with the polite inquisitiveness of a man who was genuinely interested but did not know how to ask questions that would elicit answers more interesting than a recap of spreadsheet errors. Her father ate in his usual silence. Her mother filled the conversational gaps with commentary about the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson's roses were overpruned again, and had Catherine noticed that the Hendersons had finally repainted their shutters, and honestly, the etoile in this development was a joke. No one enforced anything, it was practically anarchy. Catherine listened. She contributed. She performed the role of wife and mother and resident with the competence of a woman who had been practicing for 2 decades. And inside, in the private interior space that no one at the table could see or access, she felt the grief moving through her like weather, a storm system that would pass, she knew, but that was very much present right now, darkening the edges of everything. This was what Richard had given her, and what he had taken away. He had given her the capacity to feel deeply, recklessly, with her whole chest, and in doing so he had made the rest of her life feel insufficient. The quiet domesticity that had once been merely disappointing was now intolerable. The love she and David shared, the stable, reliable, utterly passionless bond they had constructed over 12 years of marriage, felt like a costume she had been assigned and could not remove. She was not asking for drama. She was not asking for the high of a secret hotel room and a 3 a.m. phone call and a compass necklace hidden beneath her blouse. She was asking for something simpler and harder, to feel like the life she was living was the life she had chosen, not the life she had settled for. And Richard had shown her, by leaving, that she could not have both. She could not keep the lessons and lose the lover. She could not integrate the growth and remain in the same marriage. The affair had opened a door in her that could not be closed, and every day since the ending found her standing at that threshold, looking in both directions, back toward the familiar emptiness of her marriage, forward toward a future she could not yet see, and trying to decide which way to step. By September, something had shifted. It happened not in a dramatic moment but in a quiet accumulation of small choices, the way a path forms across a lawn, from the first tentative shortcut taken by one person, then another, until the grass is worn to bare earth and everyone understands, without being told, that this is the way to walk. Catherine had started taking long drives on Sunday afternoons. Not to escape, she was past escape, but to think. She would leave the house after lunch, when David was upstairs reading military history and the kids were scattered to their separate adolescent orbits, and she would drive out of the city, through the towns that fringed Charlotte's sprawl, Matthews, Monroe, Weddington, places with names that sounded like they belonged in a country song about heartbreak and highway lines. She would drive until the suburbs gave way to farmland and the farmland gave way to sky, and she would pull over on some rural route and sit in the car with the windows down and the September air moving through the car like a breathing thing, and she would let herself feel whatever she was feeling without trying to fix it or flee from it. She was learning, slowly and imperfectly, that Greece was not a problem to be solved but a territory to be inhabited. She was learning that missing Richard was not a sign of weakness or a failure of will but simply the appropriate response to losing someone who had mattered. She was learning that healing was not a destination but a direction, a heading, a bearing, the way the compass rose on her necklace always pointed toward. She wore the necklace again now, Not every day. She was past the need for daily talismans, but on Sundays, when she was driving alone and no one was watching and the only witness was the sky and the road and whatever the day decided to bring, she would put it on before she left the house, and she would drive and she would think about the whole arc of it. The conference, the group chat, the first phone call, the hotel room, the months of hunger and then the months of learning to be full, the phone call in February, the slow goodbye, the summer of grief, and now this quiet, ordinary, remarkable afternoon in a car on a back road in North Carolina, with the windows down and the radio playing something old and sad that she had not heard since college, and the feeling that she was going to be okay. Not today, maybe. Not every day. But eventually, and in the direction of something she could not yet name. She pulled into a gas station outside a town called Albemarle and went inside to buy a bottle of water. The man behind the counter was young, maybe 22, with a tattoo of a compass on his forearm. Catherine paid for the water and then, for reasons she could not explain, she said, "I like your compass tattoo." He looked down at his arm as if he had forgotten it was there. "Thanks. My dad got me that after I graduated high school. He said I was about to head into uncharted territory and I needed something to point me in the right direction." "Did it work?" He smiled, a real smile, uncomplicated, the smile of someone who had not yet been worn down by the accumulated weight of adult life. "Honestly, I have no idea. But I look at it sometimes and it helps. Just to remember that somewhere in the world, north is still north, and if I ever get completely lost, I can find my way back to something." Catherine nodded. She walked back to her car. She sat in the driver's seat with the water bottle and her cup holder and the compass necklace resting against her collarbone and the late afternoon light falling through the windshield in that specific way it does in early autumn, golden and slanted, as if the sun is making one last generous offer before the winter takes everything back. She thought about Richard. Not with the jagged grief of February or the raw ache of June, but with something softer, a tenderness, the way you might think about a book that changed you, or a song you heard once at a particular moment in your life and never quite forgot. He had changed her. She did not wish he hadn't. She wished he was still here, and she wished she had never met him, and these two wishes were not contradictory but simply the full and honest expression of what it meant to have been changed by something that was also a loss. She started the car. She turned the radio up. She drove home. And when she walked through the front door, David was in the kitchen making dinner, actually making dinner, not heating something pre-made, but standing at the stove with an apron that Catherine did not remember owning and a recipe open on his phone that he held at a distance because he needed reading glasses he had not yet admitted he needed. And the kitchen smelled like garlic and rosemary and the particular warmth of a man who had decided, for reasons he would never articulate, to cook his wife a meal. "Hey," he said, looking up. "How was your drives?" Catherine stood in the doorway of her kitchen in the late afternoon light and she looked at her husband, this man she had married at 30 because she had confused stability for love, this man who had been gone for half of their marriage and present for the other half in body but rarely in spirit, this man who was trying, in his own clumsy and imperfect way, to reach her across a distance that neither of them had ever mapped, and she felt something she had not felt in his presence in more than a decade. Not the rush of passion she had found in Richard's arms. Not the electric recognition of being truly known. But something quieter. Something that might, with time and intention, grow into something more. A foundation. A starting point. The bare ground on which something might, eventually, be built. "It was good," she said. "It was really good." She walked across the kitchen. She kissed him on the cheek, which she did every day and which meant nothing and everything, The small daily intimacy that had survived the affair and the grief and the long summer of figuring out who she was now that she had been broken open and remade. He smelled like garlic and also like the familiar soap he had used for 12 years, and beneath that, something else, the faintest trace of effort, of intention, of a man who had looked at his marriage and decided, quietly, without announcement, to try. She did not know what it would become. She did not know if trying was enough, or whether the distance between them was too vast to bridge, or whether the woman she had become after Richard would be able to coexist with the woman David had married. She knew only that she was here, in this kitchen, with this man, and that she was willing to find out. And that, she thought, as she tied on the other apron, the one Emma had given her last Mother's Day with a cartoon character she didn't recognize on the front, was as much as anyone could honestly promise. It was as much as she had,